Chapter 31. Dolores was sitting, it seemed, in the same place as the night before. Her pose was so similar it was hard to believe she had gone to sleep, eaten breakfast, or even patted her firm hairdo. Dad said sportily, "Hello, kid," and walked toward the bathroom. I greeted her. "Hello, Dolores." We had long dropped the pretense of familial relationship. She responded briefly but politely, and threaded her attention through the eye of her needle. She was now prudently making cute kitchen curtains, which would soon starchily oppose the wind. Having nothing more to say, I went to my room. Within minutes, an argument ensued in the living room area that was as audible to me as if the separating walls were muslin sheets. "Bailey, you've let your children come between us." "Kid, you're too sensitive. My children can't come between us unless you let them." "How can I stop it?" She was crying. "They're doing it." Then she said, "You gave your daughter your jacket." Was I supposed to let her freeze to death? "Is that what you'd like, kid?" He laughed. "You would, wouldn't you?" "Bailey, you know I wanted to like your children, but they..." She couldn't bring herself to describe us. "Why the hell don't you say what you mean? You're a pretentious little bitch, aren't you? That's what Marguerite called you, and she's right." I shivered to think how that revelation would add to her iceberg of hate for me. "Marguerite can go to hell, Bailey Johnson. I'm marrying you. I don't want to marry your children." "More pity for you, you unlucky sow. I am going out. Good night." The front door slammed. Dolores cried quietly and broke the piteous whimpers with sniffles and a few dainty nose blows into her handkerchief. In my room, I thought my father was mean and cruel. He had enjoyed his Mexican holiday and still was unable to prefer a bit of kindness to the woman who had waited patiently, busying herself with housewifely duties. I was certain that she knew he'd been drinking, and she must have noticed that although we were away over 12 hours, we hadn't brought one tortilla into the house. I felt sorry and even a little guilty. I had enjoyed myself too. I had been eating chicharrones while she probably sat praying for his safe return. I had defeated a car and a mountain as she pondered over my father's fidelity. There was nothing fair or kind about the treatment, so I decided to go out and console her. The idea of spreading mercy indiscriminately, or to be more correct, spreading it on someone I really didn't care about, enraptured me. I was basically good, not understood and not even liked, but even so, just and better than just. I was merciful. I stood in the center of the floor, but Dolores never looked up. She worked the thread through the flowered cloth as if she were sewing the torn ends of her life together. I said in my Florence Nightingale voice, "Dolores, I don't mean to come between you and Dad. I wish you'd believe me." There, it was done. My good deed balanced the rest of the day. With her head still bent, she said, "No one was speaking to you, Marguerite. It's rude to eavesdrop on other people's conversations." Surely she wasn't so dumb as to think these paper walls were made of marble. I let just the tiniest shred of impudence enter my voice. "I have never eavesdropped in my life. A deaf person would have been hard put not to hear what you said. I thought I'd tell you that I have no interest in coming between you and my father. That's all." My mission had failed and succeeded. She refused to be pacified, but I had shown myself in a favorable and Christian light. I turned to go. "No, that's not all." She looked up. Her face was puffy and her eyes swollen red. "Why don't you go back to your mother, if you've got one?" Her tone was so subdued she might have been telling me to cook a pot of rice. If I'd got one, well, I'd tell her. "I've got one, and she's worlds better than you, prettier too, and intelligent, and, her voice keen to a point, she's a whore. Maybe if I had been older, or had had my mother longer, or understood Dolores's frustration more deeply, my response would not have been so violent. I know that the awful accusation struck not so much at my filial love as at the foundation of my new existence. If there was a chance of truth in the charge, I would not be able to continue to live with Mother, and so I wanted to. I walked to Dolores, enraged at the threat. I'm gonna slap you for that, you silly old bitch. I warned her and I slapped her. She was out of the chair like a flea, and before I could jump back, she had her arms around me. Her hair was under my chin, and she wrapped her arms, it seemed 2 or 3 times around my waist. I had to push her shoulders with all my strength to unlock the octopus hold. Neither of us made a sound until I finally shoved her back onto the sofa. Then she started screaming. Silly old fool. What did she expect if she called my mother a whore? I walked out of the house. On the steps, I felt something wet on my arm and looked down to find blood. Her screams still sailed through the evening air like skipping stones, but I was bleeding. I looked carefully on my arm, but there was no cut. I put my arm back to my waist and it brought fresh blood as I pulled it away. I was cut. Before I could fully understand or comprehend enough to respond, Dolores opened the door screaming still, and upon seeing me, instead of slamming the door, she ran like a mad woman down the stairs. I saw a hammer in her hand, and without wondering if I would be able to take it from her, I fled. Dad's car sat in a yard twice in one day, offering magnificent refuge. I jumped in, rolled up the windows, and locked the door. Dolores flitted around the car, screaming like a banshee, her face bedizened with fury. Daddy Bailey and the neighbors he was visiting responded to the screams and crowded around her. She shouted that I had jumped on her and tried to kill her, and Bailey had better not bring me back in the house. I sat in the car feeling the blood slip down to my buttocks as the people quieted and cooled her rage. My father motioned for me to open the window, and when I did, he said he would take Dolores inside, but I should stay in the car. He would be back to attend to me. The events of the day swarmed over me and made my breathing difficult. After all the decisive victories of the day, my life was to end in sticky death. If Dad stayed a very long time in the house, I was too afraid to go to the door and ask for him, and besides, my feminine training would not allow me to walk 2 steps with blood on my dress. As I had always feared, known, the trials had been for nothing. The dread of futility has been my lifelong plague. Excitement, apprehension, release, and anger had drained me of mobility. I waited for fate, the string puller, to dictate my movements. My father came down the steps in a few minutes and angrily slammed into the car. He sat in a corner of blood, and I gave no warning. He must have been pondering what to do with me when he felt the damp on his trousers. What the hell is this? He hunched himself up on a hip and brushed the pants. His hands showed red in the porch's cast-off light. What is this, Marguerite? I said with a coldness that would have done him proud. I've been cut. What do you mean, cut? It only lasted a precious minute, but I managed once to see my father perplexed. Cut. It was so delicious. I didn't mind draining away into the plaid seat cushions. When? By whom? Daddy, even in a critical moment, wouldn't say, by who? Dolores cut me. The economy of words showed my contempt for them all. How badly? I would have reminded him that I was no doctor, and therefore was ill-equipped to do a thorough examination, but impudence would have diminished my lead. I don't know. He put the car in gear smoothly, and I enviously realized that although I had driven his car, I didn't know how to drive. I thought we were en route to an emergency hospital, and so with serenity I made plans for my death and will. As I faded into time's dateless night, I would say to the doctor, the moving finger writes and having writ moves on, and my soul would escape gracefully. Bailey was to have my books, my Lester Young records, and my love from the next world. I had groggily surrendered myself to oblivion when the car stopped. Dad said, "Okay, kid, let's go." We were in a strange driveway, and even before I got out of the car, he was on the steps of a typical Southern California ranch-type house. The doorbell chimed, and he beckoned me up the steps. When the door opened, he signaled me to stand outside. After all, I was dripping, and I could see the living room was carpeted. Dad went in, but didn't quite close the door, and a few minutes later a woman called to me in a whisper from the side of the house. I followed her into a recreation room, and she asked me where I was hurt. She was quiet, and her concern seemed sincere. I pulled off my dress, and we both looked into the open flesh on my side. She was as pleased as I was disappointed that the edges of the wound had begun to clot. She washed witch hazel over the rupture and taped me tightly with extra long band-aids. Then we went into the living room. Dad shook hands with the man he'd been talking to and thanked my emergency nurse, and we left. In the car, he explained that the couple were his friends, and he had asked the wife to look at me. He said he told her if the laceration wasn't too deep, he would be grateful if she treated it. Otherwise, he'd have to take me to a hospital. Could I imagine the scandal if people found out that his, Bailey Johnson's daughter, had been cut by his lady friend? He was, after all, a Mason, an Elk, a naval dietitian, and the first Negro deacon in the Lutheran Church. No Negro in the city would be able to hold his head up if our misfortune became common knowledge. While the lady, I never knew her name, dressed my wound, he had telephoned other friends and made arrangements for me to spend the night with them at another strange trailer in yet another mobile park. I was taken in and given night clothes and a bed. Dad said he'd see me around noon the next day. I went to bed and slept as if my death wish had come true. In the morning, neither the empty and unfamiliar surroundings nor the stiffness of my side bothered me. I made and ate a big breakfast and sat down with a slick magazine to wait for Dad. At 15, life had taught me undeniably that surrender, in its place, was as honorable as resistance, especially if one had no choice. When my father came with a jacket thrown over the striped cotton uniform he wore as a naval dietitian, he asked how I felt, gave me $1.50 and a kiss, and said he'd drop by late in the evening. He laughed as usual. Nervous? Alone, I imagined the owners returning to find me in their house and realized that I didn't even remember what they looked like. How could I bear their contempt or their pity? If I disappeared, Dad would be relieved, not to mention Dolores. I hesitated nearly too long. What would I do? Did I have the nerve to commit suicide? If I jumped in the ocean, wouldn't I come up all bloated, like the man Bailey saw in Stamps? The thought of my brother made me pause. What would he do? I waited a patience and another patience, and then he ordered me to leave. But don't kill yourself. You can always do that if things get bad enough. I made a few tuna sandwiches, lumpy with pickles, but put a Band-Aid supply in my pocket, counted my money. I had over $3 plus some Mexican coins, and walked out. When I heard the door slam, I knew the decision had gelled. I had no key, and nothing on earth would induce me to stand around until Dad's friends returned to pitying let me back in. Now that I was out free, I set to thinking of my future. The obvious solution to my homelessness concerned me only briefly. I could go home to Mother, but I couldn't. I could never succeed in shielding the gash in my side from her. She was too perceptive not to notice the crusty Band-Aids and my favoring the wound. And if I failed to hide the wound, we were certain to experience another scene of violence. I thought of poor Mr. Freeman, and the guilt which lined my heart, even after all those years, was a nagging passenger in my mind.